Hi, this is Dermot Smyth, professor with liberal arts, and I have the pleasure of having two of my liberal arts colleagues here, Dr. Laurie Carlson and Dr. Kaufman. And today I've invited them onto Zoom to have a conversation on the heels of the 48th Forum on Tolerance, Still Fighting Sexism and Misogyny. So they've generously given us our time, and we're going to talk about some of these issues on the cusp of the forum. And would you like to introduce yourselves, guys?
So my name is Laurie Carlson. I'm a professor here of both English and Gender and Women's Studies. I'm also the chair of the Gender and Women's Studies department at North Shore Community College, and I'm the chair of the Forums on Tolerance. And I'm excited that Dermot invited me and Kara here to talk about this.
Hi, I'm Kara Kaufman. I'm a professor in the History department and in the Gender and Women's Studies department. I'm also a faculty fellow at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Innovation here at North Shore Community College. And I love working with these two wonderful people. So I'm excited as well.
Thank you, guys. So I guess to start, can either of you or both, obviously, talk about the recent rise or recent iteration of misogyny that we've seen and how there are potentially historical corollaries to the alignment of misogyny and specifically fascism?
So being a historian and a historian of gender and sexuality, I am thinking of the rise of fascism in Germany in the 1930s, obviously under Hitler, and the type of masculinity that was hegemonic at the time, and similarities to the rise of authoritarianism around the world, specifically also in this country with Trump and Trumpism. And there are some overlaps. So the rise of a type of masculinity in the 1930s really harkened back to this mythological past where Germany was this, utopian land of farms and manual labor and anti-bourgeois, if you will, type of masculinity. It's very anti-modernism, which is often odd because of fascism and industrialization. But I'm on a tangent. So, Hitler's type of gender roles were really traditional. The father, first of all, the nuclear family was heterosexual, mother, father, children. So the idea of being a father, working with your hands out in the rural space, which creates a specific type of body and a specific type of physique, one that is physically strong. The other characteristics of that was, the family. You were expected to have children. Mothers were expected to be mothers, not working women, right? And it also encompassed, if you're the right type of masculine man, that meant there was an other that was opposed to you, right? So the other took on many different characteristics. Any kind of LGBTQ people, any kind of disabled people, of course, Jewish humans, men or women, but especially men. They were very stereotyped as the wrong kind of body. Often portrayed as portly, crooked nose, bulging eyes, very scary. Whereas the German man, the essential German man was the opposite of that, very good looking, thin, etc. So today, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of similarities. The other for today is anybody who's not white, anybody who's not conservative Christian, anybody who is not anybody who's not an elite, right? That's kind of a squishy category. A lot of people can fall into the elites, specifically anti-intellectual. Same thing in 1930s Germany, anti-intellectual. Anybody who's, again, part of the LGBTQ community. And so the type of masculinity, the hegemonic masculinity today, also traditional gender roles, harkening back, like Make America Great Again, right? Harkening back to this mythological America and mythological gender roles that never really was reality. So that's some of the comparisons that I see.
And I'm so glad that Carrie did the historical context, but she is a historian and I don't have to be, so that's very nice. But it's been interesting. So I write a lot about sci-fi and cyberculture. So I know a lot of people who do the same and have gone to conferences before COVID. And, you know, one of the people who I have met is Anita Sarkeesian, who is the person who was first targeted.
Wow.
Like I've met her a couple of times over conferences over the years. And it's weird how like a lot of this for me, like I saw the very beginning and like people don't listen for quite some time, right? Like if you were in like feminist circles and you're like, hey, we got to pay attention to this. This is a big problem. So, you know, back in 2014, where like, you know, social media certainly became more and more prominent. I think one aspect that became more and more prominent too with Instagram, right? Instagram, there's Instagram and there's like reality and there's like how people look on Instagram, particularly women and men with filters and how they portray themselves. So there's this one aspect of like the internet, right? And then you have 4chan, which I think I honestly don't remember if 4chan or 8chan proceeded, to be honest with you, but
4chan before 8chan, yeah.
Okay, so 4chan was like the iteration back then, and I've actually been targeted by them before too, which is very odd because I'm not that well published. But at any rate, Anita at the time she was writing about violence in video games and particularly violence against women in video games and why it was problematic. And then a lot of men who gather on places like 4chan, they were really angry about it because that's, as someone who doesn't identify maybe with what they consider like the chads or the traditional masculinity, this is like the thing that they had. So they started targeting Anita. I mean, specifically, they sent death threats. Like her family were receiving multiple death threats. She had to leave her home. She had to like, you know, not let anyone know where she was. And I mean, it's weird. It just seemed like everything exploded at the beginning. There was that. And then you had one of the first of 9 shootings by people who identify as incels, and that was near the Santa Barbara campus in California. And they happened like right around the same time. And like I was terrified. And this was 8 years ago. And it's been crazy to see like the evolution over this, right? Over the internet. It hasn't gotten smaller. It seems to grow and grow. And like once COVID hit, like it exploded, right? It's just been terrifying to witness, like as someone like, because when you can see something's happening, you try to talk to other people and it takes them a while. And I even remember I have a friend from high school who is very traditional masculinity. He's in the military. And when the Santa Barbara shooting happened, like I used to post on social media a lot. I don't anymore because I was tired of being harassed and I'm tired. But at the time I posted something being like, why don't we like acknowledge that white cis angry men are probably like the real terrorist threat? And that was after Santa Barbara. And he like, this person like was like, I can't even believe you're saying this. And we argued back and forth. And it's crazy to have seen like the evolution of that and just getting worse and worse. I mean, we had the mass murder at the yoga studio, at the massage studio. And it's scary to witness. And to me, the thing that when Kara talks about, you know, our ideas of masculinity and our constructs of masculinity, we have this idea in our society, and our society is a white supremacist patriarchal capitalist society. So we have this construct of masculinity that leaves most people out. Those who are angry and identify as incels and other conspiracy theories on the internet, they feel left out too. But rather than targeting this idea of white patriarchal capitalism, they attack the people who are even more victimized by this concept, which is very strange. I mean, they certainly grew on Reddit. There used to be a lot of Reddit spaces, which I've been kind of obsessed with Reddit for years, but most of them have been banned by now. But a lot of like, there was one that's men going their own way. And then there was an incel space. And, you saw them like grow and grow, and just like this hatred, and particularly it's like this idea that women are always having sex. Like as a woman, I could just walk anywhere I want and just have sex like in 5 minutes. Apparently that's like a thing that I can do, which that kind of eludes me. So women, our only value is sex, right? And
having babies as well.
What's that?
Having babies.
Oh, having babies too, but they don't want to have babies. They just want the sex part, the incels. And we're not giving them the sex that they feel entitled to, but we're giving them to, chads. Like apparently we only care about really attractive men because, that's what I'm looking for, is a really attractive man who spends all of his time in the gym and, doesn't read philosophy. And, that's clearly what I'm looking for. And so it's like this bizarre idea that first, men are entitled to sex. Women can have sex whenever they want. And women only value men for their looks. However, this community only values women based on their looks and their sexuality and their ability to give sex. Yeah. It's just been a strange, depressing explosion. And I'm glad that it's taking 7 years, but the federal government finally is actually tracking incel groups as domestic terrorism. Canada did it before us. They did it a couple of years ago, but because it's been just as big a problem in Canada. There have been incidents there, but I don't know. It seems like maybe 2014 they could have started tracking these terrorists.
Yeah, on the heels of Gamergate. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing up Circus, Anita. But this is the thing. Right? So these spaces are radicalizing, right? And they're one of the things I think is pervasive is this. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the conflation of irony and humor into hate. This notion of that hate speech should not. Recently, and I showed the clip to my students. Tucker Carlson had said there's no such thing as hate speech. There's hate speech that people hate, which is not necessary. It's not true. And there is this conflation of free speech with being able to say anything you want. Right. And these spaces, as you'd said, the CHAM boards and whatnot have the ability to exercise that for a lot of young, specifically young men. What is it that draws them to this? And can you speak a little bit about this notion of aggrieved entitlement? The maturation process of boys and girls is vastly different. And from an American perspective, maybe if you can lean in on that as well. Why are these men flocking to these groups? Definitely it's situational. It's from speed and scale. The internet has obviously made things a lot worse, and I think COVID has exacerbated that. Definitely, that should be part of what we should talk about. But what is it initially that makes them feel that sense of entitlement? Is it from a historical perspective, the mythology of rugged individualism? Why do men feel this a problem with this prescriptive notion of masculinity?
So as we're doing this, it's Veterans Day right now. It's November 2022. I live on Main Street, and there's a parade going by me for Veterans Day parade. And all I can think of is the military and the way it's masculinized and what it means and how that's changing. And as we're talking about this, and there's a historian that I follow pretty closely. His name is Timothy Snyder. He's out of Yale. And he's made it his life's mission to study authoritarianism, specifically Russian, Ukrainian, Eastern Europe, and the rise of authoritarianism in Russia and Germany. So one of the things that he said right before our election, which happened just this week, midterm election, right? He put out this 13-minute video and said, if we keep going with the way that we're going in our rise of illiberal democracy, if there's a contestation of 2024 election, we will see our country divide. One party backing Democratic presidential candidate and the other backing the Republican one clearly will lose, but they're not going to accept that, right? Anyway, what I'm trying to get at is he said that the military and law enforcement will divide as well. And we're seeing this radicalization in our military forces and in our law enforcement, where there are studies done about, hypermasculine, toxic masculinity and misogyny is rife through our military forces, which can get into all kinds of things. But I just wanted to put that there, because literally, if you hear a parade, I'm sorry, but they're going through. So back to your question. So I study masculinity, and one of the best professors, scholars who study this, his name is Michael Kimmel, and he coined the phrase aggrieved entitlement. And I think that's perfect. It's perfect. It's beautiful to explain this toxic masculinity whenever it comes up and however it comes up. And this is where the far right really does a beautiful job in their propaganda and their media cycles of blaming the victim for white men's problems, right? So white cisgender men are constantly talked to as if they are losing something, right? They're losing their power, they're losing their status, they're losing their jobs, etc. So when you hear the sentence, for example, a Black woman stole my job, you should ask yourself, coming from a white cisgendered male, okay, middle-class male, you should ask yourself, which word in that sentence is the most important? And for the aggrieved entitlement theory, the word is my. So a Black woman stole my job, right? So historically, especially in this country, white men have had the power, right? Ever since before this country was even colonized, or as it was colonizing, before it was even a country, right? We have structured it such that white propertied men have all of the things: power, control, property, voting, representation, etc. And now that we're seeing another wave of civil rights, the last wave was the 1960s and 70s. Now that we're having another wave of civil rights and social justice, we're trying to balance the pieces of the pie, if you will. And so white men are being told, and from a media point of view, I think this is brilliant, although horrible, but it's working. They're stealing your jobs. They're stealing your women, right? You don't have the access to higher education because of affirmative action. It's yours. So it's this aggrieved entitlement that's along with who they are as men and white men.
Kara did a really nice job, I think, of summing up what Michael Kimmel says about aggrieved masculinity. And there is this idea that if you look back at I don't say the idea of what a nuclear family and being a man is in the 1950s and 60s from sitcoms, you're supposed to, grow up and have a good job where you can afford to have a family, and your family will, will allow you to have a woman who will stay at home and will take care of the kids. But we don't live in a society where people can do that anymore because of capitalism, right? Rather than attacking white patriarchal capitalism, they attack those who are further victimized, right? The reason why you can't grow up in a society where one person is the bread, nobody can do that anymore. We're all just so tired, and that's part of it. Capitalism keeps you tired. It keeps you defeated. It keeps you on the edge, and they're feeling all that. So rather than deconstructing what the ideal of masculinity is, they again attack those who are further victimized. I love Michael Kimball Jackson Katz is another favorite of mine, and like, you know, he breaks down some of these influences in our idea of masculinity, military culture certainly being one, sports culture being one. Like, you know, sports, if you look at when I was a kid in the 80s, I used to be really into baseball. Baseball players just look skinny, like look like normal skinny people. Now they get more and more muscular, right? There's this new muscularity that to be an athlete, you're supposed to be super muscular. We had all the different steroids, you know, scandals. Then there's also the film industry, right, with action movies and action heroes, and our idealized, like whether it's Rambo or, you know, whether it's the Terminator. And then we have just the media in general and advertising does idealize like a certain kind of white dominant male masculinity where women are there to please men, and these are things that have been taught at them for years. And now you've grown up and you feel completely isolated because our society is very isolating. You feel tired, you feel poor, you haven't had any of these things that you idealize. So what can you do? Blame somebody else, right? That's that whole aggrieved. I was entitled to this as a white cisgender male in my society. I didn't get this. So I'm angry. Who can I target that anger at? Which is kind of sad. And like, you know, just another thing too, if we think our society hates women, it's a very misogynist society. Part of that misogyny is we don't have men teaching in elementary schools anymore. When I was a kid, we had, I want to say it was like at least 50-50. Being an elementary school, junior high teacher used to be a very laudable profession for men. It's not anymore. Since associated with women, the pay has gone down, the prestige has gone down. Apparently, if you're a male who wants to teach, you know, junior high, elementary school kids, you're looked at as some kind of pedophile or some kind of not man. So you have these young men growing up where they don't have any teachers who are men if they need to relate to a male. Most therapists are women. I mean, in general, the industry, like, it's so hard to get a therapist at all, but if you're a male who's looking for a male therapist, but that's even if you seek therapy because you were growing up in a society where you're not supposed to talk about your feelings. I mean, I will say, as being a woman, that's something we're really good at, is creating communities. And that's something I think everyone's searching for. So you have these young men, they don't have a way of finding communities. They find one online, right? They find one in their video games, and they find this other community. It might not be the right community and might not make them happier, but they are searching for something.
Absolutely. I think that's filling that void. I think when you talk to a lot of, you know, some of them who manage to get out of these, some of the maybe even deeper conspiratorial communities like Q, when they manage to untangle themselves, what they don't miss necessarily is the reverie of the experience of research. And I do believe that's a massive part of this, doing my own research. And we know how, you know, clickbait, Google bombing can lead them to information and algorithmically. But what they miss is community. Yeah, it's this lack of this togetherness in a way. And these DAOs in groups are extremely important. So I love that you mentioned Rambo because and Schwarzenegger, because I talk about that sort of notion of how it's articulated in culture, and coming off the cusp of the emasculation of Vietnam, and certainly, you know, there's a huge boom of that macho culture in the 80s. And how do you think that's articulated itself now? Do you think there's if there, you know, I mean, I do believe there is. The backlash to, let's say, fourth wave feminism, and the worry from a perspective of who it's leaving out. Specifically because of and the reason I say this is because recently I've been talking about the kind of disparity in socioeconomics in regards to news, who has access to news, informational sources, and recently when I saw the rule change on Twitter with the decision to verify, which is now framed as a status thing as opposed to an actual authentic fire. This will push marginalized voices further down the scale of in a massive forum that was very important for social activism and social actors who do not have a voice. You know, and it's specifically that ties into this notion of technocratic ableism that many writers are talking about.
Okay, so I guess I'll talk about feminism in general, just like the progression to fourth wave feminism and recent backlash, because that seems like where we're going. So, feminism obviously is the belief in equality among the sexes. And I mean, I usually frame it to my students like, oh, so like if you care about equality, you're feminist. Exactly. And I truly believe you can't be a feminist and not be intersectional, but that wasn't always the case. So, first wave feminism started when women were fighting for the right to vote, which we didn't get to 1920. And, the first wave feminism, one of the problematics is they linked up with abolitionist groups. Not that itself is problematic. The problematics lied in a lot of the leaders of first wave feminism were wealthy white women who they work with these abolitionist groups, but it wasn't because they cared about equality for people of color. Some of them, some of them, really didn't want Black men to get the vote before them. There's a lot of fractures in like that first wave, but first wave, specifically working on the right to vote. Second wave feminism happens, say roughly about late 60s, 70s, and that is, actually fighting for, stopping sexual harassment in the workplace, stopping, creating domestic violence laws. Sexual harassment before there were laws against it, it was just like a day in the office, right? So fighting against lack of equal pay, which sadly we're still fighting against. So it was trying to actually make some gains in equality for women. Like a lot of my professors who I had in grad school, mostly white women, they're part of that second wave, right? Third wave feminism is probably the one that I've identified as most just of my age. And so third wave feminism was coined by Rebecca Walker, who's Alice Walker's daughter. I think like maybe it was the early 90s anyhow. I would have to look up the date, but she said the third wave of feminism is online. So third wave feminism was moving this kind of activism that second wave has certainly been part of, fighting for civil rights. And we have like, the internet now, and it's a space where you can organize online, right? Like we think of the Me Too movement, it wouldn't have happened without social media or the internet. The same with Black Lives Matter. They found this means and this way of organizing online. But as you've mentioned, the problem with that and what COVID taught us is not everyone has access to that, particularly so many more people don't than we ever realized. And I think that's something we learned just from seeing students in K through 12, just in the United States, that's supposed to be, one of the wealthiest nations in the world. So many people don't have access to good internet. They don't have access to good technology. And so I think something that fourth wave feminism is trying to correct is, wait, hold up. Maybe like the internet isn't this like utopia for activism. There's all these communities that have these really like hegemonic ideas of organizing. There's a lot of bad things and not everyone has access to it. It is certainly poorer people in countries without really good internet infrastructures, disabled people like are being left out. So like maybe we should take a look at like this way of organizing. Maybe we should look at some of the premises like feminism is based upon. I would argue that both third and fourth wave are very concerned with intersectionality, very different ways. And this backlash against feminism, it's not new. It's certainly, certainly not new in my lifetime. I think sometimes the voices are louder. I have noticed though, even women are less and less likely to identify as a feminist, which is really sad for me, but that's because they see these media portrayals that have happened certainly very heavily in the last 6 years since like the first Trump campaign, where feminists are portrayed as these angry, miserable, male-hating women who we hate children. We just want to have all the sex in the world and not get pregnant. We want to steal your job. And so, these men with this aggrieved masculinity, the one thing they're afraid of is being identified as being feminine, because that's the worst thing you could do. So what do? They attack not just women, but particularly the women who are really proud to be female and like things that and want female empowerment and want to help other women feel empowered. That's a really easy target because they don't want to be like women.
Yeah. Cara, do you want to jump in?
Well, Laurie was giving this beautiful rundown of the differences in waves of feminism. Towards the end, when she was talking, Kanye West popped into my head. I guess he goes by Ye or Ye, not sure how to pronounce that. Which then made me think of, why is a man of color drinking the toxic hegemonic masculinity of white authoritarian people in this country? What is that phenomenon? Like whenever you see Trump in rallies, he stages behind him Blacks for Trump, right? Mm-hmm. If this feminist wave is about like intersectionality and you know, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, like what's going on with Black men jumping on a bandwagon for this white supremacist version of masculinity? And this is something that I talk about in my classes. And one of the theories is that the people who are othered, right? So whether it's Black men or youth in high schools who are being bullied, they take on the hegemonic ideal. At this point, the hegemonic ideal for Black, Kanye West is jumping on the Trump bandwagon and wearing a White Lives Matter t-shirt and all that. Bullied youth in high school, they take on the hegemonic ideal of masculinity as in control, violent, not vulnerable, not weak, etc. The reason why they take on these is because they think in order to get there, right, in order to have some kind of power, share, you know, the capitalist ideal, etc., I have to take on my oppressor's identity and perform it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's really fascinating when we study people like Kanye West or bullies or school shooters even taking on the violent persona to show everybody that they're in the in-group, right? Mm-hmm. Or the women, for example, the white women who take on patriarchal norms and say, I'm not a feminist. I don't want to work. I want to be, you know, taking care of my husband, et cetera, et cetera. They've taken on this version of gender roles that is contrary to what they what's it? I'm sorry, I can't think of the word. It's against their own self-interest, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah.
So that's just what I was thinking when Laurie was talking about why you see like TERFs. What's the acronym?
I actually
exclusionary radical
feminists. Yeah,
right.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's okay.
Oh.
Trans exclusionary radical feminists. Like, what's the author of Harry Potter?
J.K. Rowling.
Thank you. You know why feminism is like what Laurie was saying. We're trying to make these communities, right? And in community we can be powerful. In community we can change things. Why are we excluding trans people, trans women? Like that doesn't make any sense to me. And this is something I said at the Forum on Tolerance. Why are we, in our language, sometimes belittling and denigrating white cis men? Like men need feminism. Men need to be part of this community.
What do you mean? What do you mean denigrating white? Denigrating language.
Sorry?
So when you said denigrating language of men, do you mean targeting the sort of emasculine types?
No. Like sometimes women will be very angry and violent in their rhetoric against white cisgendered men, as in if they're the problem and it's actually patriarchy that affects everybody. And so when we get into like men's rights groups saying feminists are feminazis and they're horrible people and they hate men, and no, sometimes women feminists use rhetoric or language that's not helpful, right? But that's not the majority of feminists. And men need feminism in order to help their own cause. So I'll let Laurie pick up on that.
No, that was a great segue. So, I mean, I'm always saddened that like people can't find their shared oppression and like work together as a community to what's actually keeping you down, right?
Yeah.
Trisha Hillen's columns is one of my favorite writers. She wrote Black Feminist Thought, and she talks about the matrices of domination and oppression. And this idea that there's a spider web and there's all these different things that are keeping people down. There's racism, there's sexism, there's ableism, there's classism. And what she says is, there's no oppression Olympics. You can't rank these different kinds of oppressions. If these are happening, none of us are free. What we need to do is fight what is actually oppressing us, which in her eyes is white supremacist patriarchal capitalism, which is where we get this ideal of white masculinity. And I must say, I say that phrase so much, someone might hear that and think I'm saying I dislike white cis men. I certainly don't. I'm married to one. What I dislike is we have this ridiculous created neoliberal capitalist society that has this constructed ideal of what that is. That's not what most people I know are. I certainly know very few, but it's the thing that's hurting all of us, right? Like, rather than looking at like the structure of our society and how it's harming all of us, whether we're disabled, whether, we're of color, whether we're female, whether we just don't meet that ideal of masculinity, we're attacking those even lower than us, and that's a problem. Like if we could figure out how to use these communities to do something more productive, that would be great. And I don't know why we can. I mean, it's distressing. Like Kara talks about like the history of fascism. Like I never thought in my lifetime that people would be like enamored by a fascist president, like celebrity from reality TV. I would have thought that you completely made that up and you couldn't have convinced me to do that at all, but it's happening. So I don't know if like people feel so out of control in their lives and they have no control over their income or what happens in their lives that maybe fascism is comforting to them. I don't know, but it's frightening. But men need feminism again, because like if we had an equal world that wasn't tiered on this idea of white supremacist patriarchal capitalism, you wouldn't feel so sad and tired and angry and lonely and isolated.
Yes, as you had mentioned about Trump, I just recently saw an ad from America First Legal, which is Stephen Miller's group, which is it's a white supremacist ad talking about white grievances, about how white people are being oppressed, and it's airing every other second on all these cycles on Spotify. And do you think there's a is that worrying to you guys? Do you think this might be corrected because of do you think we're going to maybe get over this hump of this I guess the permissible nature of hate and its core and it being framed as free speech? And how worrying is that from a stochastic terroristic perspective?
I think it's getting worse, unfortunately. I mean, I've obviously I teach literature and film and I believe in free speech, but like I think as a society, we really need to figure out what we mean by that. Like there's, the ADL always does a really good job, the Anti-Defamation League, of saying like, we have to allow free speech, and how you counteract hate speech is you counter that with the truth. But I don't think people know what the truth is anymore. And I worry particularly like with misinformation shared online. I mean, these incel groups, like they're getting worse. Like they're talking about like rape and murder of women. I mean, it's not getting better, particularly for misogyny. I think it's getting a lot worse. And I mean, there are people who now are completely comfortable walking around with Confederate flags on the North Shore as they're like campaigning for Deal on election day. Deal, whose whole, I mean, I would never think in Massachusetts, like a Trump sycophant would have like an entire platform based on the hatred of trans people, and basically, and like, I mean, that was his whole, commercial I kept hearing whenever I would try to listen to music, because my kids hate my NPR and they want me to put on music. His whole thing was like, Democrats have ruined education because they want to teach about all 86 genders rather than math and English. And it just seems like it's getting so worse. And I think we as a civil society have to like figure out like what is hate speech and where does the line go? Because I think we've already crossed that line in so many instances. Like even, the freedom of speech is supposed to be that caveat, you can't yell fire in a crowded building, but that's happening all the time. So, I mean, how do we address that? And I have the answer to that, but it really needs to be addressed. And I think we mentioned in our back and forth, you have these different chat rooms because young men, they play video games, and you have people who are targeting these lonely, isolated young men who are very vulnerable, and they're slowly recruiting them, not just for like misogynist groups. I mean,
oh no, absolutely.
Al-Qaeda, they've been recruited for Al-Qaeda or white supremacist groups. That's where they do most of their recruiting, is on these video game platforms. It's terrifying. Like, I don't know what can be done, but like it's something we have to figure out.
Yeah, the decentralization of these platforms gives them plausible deniability, and then the shift from virtual to actual real inaction of violence is that slippery slope. Is, that sounds like a slippery slope argument, but it's a real thing. Yeah, absolutely, I totally agree. Cara, do you want to touch on this?
Yeah, so this topic is really personal to me because I've got a father who's gone down the rabbit hole so much that he has lost any grip on reality. And I was talking about this in my class this week, right before the election, and I'm like, look, I'm a historian, and we live and die on evidence, right? Well, it used to be pretty hard prior to the internet. It used to be pretty hard to doctor evidence. They did it, but it's pretty hard, right? Now, anybody can do their own research. I hate that. I really hate that saying. And I was talking about reality. If people aren't willing to agree on a set of facts coming from real evidence, then we are in trouble, because we can't have a productive conversation, right? And I said, journalism, people who study to be journalists, they have to take an ethics class, right? Like there's ethics in journalism. If you have a source and that source is telling you something, they have to go check that source. So they need other sources to confirm that source so that they've got a fact, right? They can establish, okay, we have a fact, and they go on from there. So if you have a group coming from internet like QAnon and things like that, who questions reality itself, and then you layer that on to people who are aggrieved, right? They are entitled, they are aggrieved, like my father, who is a cisgendered, upper middle class white man. And his brother, to make it worse, is an ex-FBI agent. And he's even more radicalized than my father, okay? So I don't talk to my father anymore. I don't think they've taken it from the virtual space to the real space in any kind of violent way, but relationships are ending, right? People, one of the ways that I see, and I don't have any evidence to this, I'm a hypocrite, right? But just from my own little life, what I'm noticing is, because people aren't playing in the same reality, you can't have a conversation. You can't have a good debate and exchange of ideas. So now we're separated, right? And like, I don't talk to my father anymore. That's dangerous, because there's no room for discourse. There's no room for exchange of ideas and coming to common ground and agreeing to disagree, tolerance even. There's no room for that anymore. So people seem to be getting more and more siloed. And I just see this going down a path that's very destructive in real terms.
Thank you so much for talking about that, Cara. Yeah, absolutely. When I bring up Q, it's very easy for us all to be sort of, dismissive of Q being kind of such a buffet of conspiracy theories, and some of the more crazier ones being really out there about adrenochrome, and people kind of be dismissive of it. But the first thing I do when I talk about it is bring up that site, the Q Anonymous thread in subreddit, where people talk about experiences, and they talk about their personal experiences and how destructive this has been within from a smaller micro perspective of tearing families apart. That is the damage this stuff does. Thank you so much.
And to just bring this back to masculinity and gender roles, the gaslighting is unbelievable.
Oh yeah. The thought ending terminology and the shifting of the goalposts, and
my God,
it's circular argumentation. Yeah.
I've never been so gaslit in my entire life from my father, right?
Yeah.
And it's like he feels empowered, like these men feel empowered to just be a spigot of hate and misogyny, and coming from real experience, it's reality shaking. Like, I've found myself questioning my own reality, and I have to remind myself that no, I'm the one who's real here. These guys have been radicalized and they're off in space somewhere, and it has real consequences on people trying to be still fighting capitalism, fighting misogyny, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, thanks so much, you guys, both of you. Do you want to how do you want to end this? How do we end this talk? It's so awful, and it's so important we have these conversations. And so important.
I was just thinking of something I didn't mention. I feel like just thinking what Kara was just saying, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, like, with everything that's going on in the world and the returning of Roe. Like, one thing that's really happened with COVID is women who are already tired and who already did most of the stuff at home and who already did while working full time, while doing most of the childcare, it became 100 times worse, right? Schools closed down, the daycare is closed down. So women in the workforce, COVID took so many of us out of the workforce, like so many women, and all the strides that we've made with feminism to try to, and we still don't get equal pay. There's still like not equality there. That's set us back so far. So you have these cycle events, and the fact that, women have whatever like progress we've made has gone back so far. And now you have all these explosions of these like men's rights groups and these incel groups and these hate groups and conspiracy theories during COVID. And now Roe is overturned. It's like, I don't know, just something I could not have pictured in my lifetime, but it's sad, and it makes doing the work so much harder, because when you're doing all the work at home and all the childcare while you're working full time, while you're trying to like work on the stuff, you're just so tired. And so it's like I guess it's the perfect opportunity for all these things to happen. If I was a conspiracy theory kind of person, like, this was the perfect opportunity to overturn Roe.
So if there's a message of hope, what do you think that is?
I want to cling to hope. Like, I have 2 young children. Like, I think of like, if I could predicted the world, like, would I have like, brought children into it? And I think you have to believe that like there's hope. And like, I think the younger generations really do bring me hope. Like, I look at like, our students, I look at students who are of traditional age, and they get the whole non-binary gender. Do you know what I mean? They get things like that. They get that like not everybody is male or female. They're so accepting, at least where I live in my community, of like people's ability to be themselves. And, just the students, the forum that we recently had, their ability to speak eloquently about their thoughts and their concerns and their wants. I have to have hope that like, I'm not saying I want to kill the baby boomer generation or anything, but I have to have hope that things are going to get better with it. Because if you look at the younger generation, they did predominantly not vote red during this. So I think, unfortunately, white women are unsavable at this moment. White women continue to not vote for their own self-interest. I have to put my hope with women of color and the younger generation.
I guess I'm less hopeful than Laurie is. Although I am a little bit more hopeful than I was prior to Tuesday's election. Ironically, I think the overturn of Roe helped this election cycle not go down into authoritarianism yet. I am hopeful in this, it seems like there's this, what you hear on TV, read in the media, yada, 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 about anti-abortion beliefs, right? But then how people are voting, like in Kansas, right? 3 of the 4 referendums in states did not codify anti-abortion stuff. That's very hopeful. So I think we're in a state of irony at the moment, and I will cling to the state of irony.
Thank you so much to you both. Sincerely, Dr. Laurie Carlson and Dr. Kaufman for this really important conversation. And listed below in the video are a list of Laurie and Cara's coursework where you can enroll for those classes.